If you are looking to start a B5 journal or just looking for some more ideas on layouts you could include in yours, then this video is for you. In this one, we're going to be looking at over 50 different layout ideas for your B5 notebook, and the first one we have is an index. I've intentionally put some decoration down the side of this to just fill up some space, mainly because I find in my journals I don't use an index very often, so I don't often need a lot of space, but you could of course do this in 2 columns if you wanted to really maximize the page. The nice part about this type of decoration is that it gives you the opportunity to do a decorative Dutch door, so just putting down the washi tape and then cutting around the outside of this, just to give it this kind of decorative, interesting looking edge. Here though, I've just written down the pages in terms of their titles and the page numbers, and if you do enjoy using an index, I would probably be inclined to set up multiple pages just to make sure that you have enough space to write down all of the different entries. Flipping on over though, and our next layout idea is a year at a glance. Given the extra space in a B5, both vertically and horizontally, you can fit more than just one calendar year on here quite comfortably. Here you can see I have a year and a quarter, or a year and 3 months, but if I hadn't put the Dutch door in, I'd also have the opportunity to put one more calendar on each of the rows. If you don't care so much about having a title and you got rid of any kind of bottom decoration we have here, then you could probably fit 2 years on one page. A year at a glance is just really awesome to be able to see all of the calendar dates, funnily enough at a glance, but to actually record future happenings, then a future log is usually more useful. In this one you can see we just have a little box for each of 8 months, so a space to write down things that are going on. You could of course turn this into a 3-column layout and have a full year, but much like a lot of the layouts we're going to look at, there are a lot of different options when it comes to setting them up. So I wanted to include a couple of different future logs in this one. So this one here is another option, where you have a column for each of the months of the year, and then another column here to write down what the events actually are. The way you'd use this one is effectively write down the list of events, and then over from this, in the relevant column for whichever month the event is happening in, write in the day number. So if you had something happening on the 12th of January, you'd write a 12 underneath this first J, and then write in what the event was. Another option for a future log though, similar to the one we had on the other page, just having a block of space for each of the months. In this one though, you can see we've used the entire of the page, so going the full width across and fitting the full calendar year in here. The nice part about the B5 with the extra space compared to an A5 is that you have ample space to write in each of these months, but it still ends up fitting to one page. If you did find that this wasn't enough space though, you could always combine two of these boxes and then have 6 months per page, so use the entire spread for a full 12 months. Flipping over though, and the next idea we have is a work week schedule. So for this one, rather than having the full 7 days of the week, we just have 5 days, and then we have blocks of time 1 through 7 running down the side. You could think about this in terms of actual time blocks, so maybe 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon after lunch, and then 3 in the evening. Or you could put actual time brackets on here if you wanted to, but it just gives you a different way to look at your week and schedule different happenings for specific times. If you either work in or attend school, then this could also be a really good layout for that. So effectively kind of like a timetable for yourself, but we have more of those kind of ideas later in the video, mainly because a journal this size is really great as an academic planner. On this layout though, this is a quarterly schedule, so you can see we have 3 months and then a space to write down events for each of them. The idea being that you'd set up one of these each quarter, either at the start of your journal or as that quarter kind of approaches. The way that I would use this one is write out the events in terms of when they're happening, and then put maybe a little symbol or a color code on the calendars to signify when those things are happening. Flipping over though, our next idea, one of those ones related to being an academic planner, is either having a term schedule or a timetable, or I suppose both. The actual dimensions on this one kind of depend on how many weeks in your term there are. I think the longest term I ever experienced was 13 weeks, so that's what I put in here. Though you could also use a layout like this for just a quarterly schedule as well, because there are 13 weeks in a quarter. At the top I've put 7 days of the week, assuming that something is happening on the weekend, whether that be things like tutoring or sport or whatever. But in making this personalized and setting it up for yourself, you just include the number of days that are actually going to be relevant. Because when you use 7 days, the boxes do get a little bit smaller, I'd be inclined to use some symbols or a color code to indicate different happenings on the calendar, especially regular ones where you can set up a little key to say hey, this is a day where I have a test or an assignment or whatever else. On the other side though, we have the timetable, and in this one I have 2 separate weeks, each with 6 periods per day for Monday through to Friday. In this one you'd use different colours or different patterns to indicate different happenings on the timetable, so maybe different classes you're attending or teaching, but you could also use this for just a weekly schedule for yourself even if you don't work in or attend a school, kind of like an ideal weekly routine or something similar. On to the next page though. For this one we have a monthly outline, and it's kind of similar to a future log except for the fact that we have a space dedicated for each day of each of the months, and you can see we have 3 months per page. All this involves is splitting the page into 3 equal columns, then writing out the numbers 1 through 31 or however many days there are in the month, and also including a mini calendar at the top. For each of these mini calendars, we've got Monday through Sunday, and then we also have a week number at the end, just because I prefer to have week numbers on my mini calendars. I like to use them to kind of indicate the progress throughout the year. They're certainly not necessary, they're just something that I prefer. On this side though, we have a study plan. This one's broken down into a bunch of different sections, so in the assumption that this study is being done for a particular assessment or test or some kind of summative piece of work, we have details for that assessment, like when is it happening, what topics are going to be covered. We also have a little countdown so that you can indicate how much time you have left to do your study. And then for the sections underneath this one, we have a lesson checklist, so all of the different things you might want to do for each of the lessons, and then the lesson numbers across the top here. We also have a space to indicate any strengths or weaknesses that you have in the topics that were covered, mainly so you can focus on the weaknesses during your study and make sure that you're not just diving into the strengths because they feel comfortable. And at the bottom there's just a space for a general task list. I've also added a little bit of decoration to this page in this one. You don't need the decoration, but the nice part about the B5 is that you often do have space for it, so I figured I'd include it. Flipping over though, our next idea is a topic outline, and this one I included mainly with the idea of being a teacher in mind, but it doesn't actually have to just be used as a topic outline. A lot of these ideas you can just kind of retrofit them to other areas of your life. If this doesn't fit for you, then what kind of things could you use this structure for instead? Thinking about this one though, we have some general details at the top, so for instance, which class is it for, what dates are they happening, what kind of assessments are you having. We have a space to plan out all of the things for each of the lessons, so listing out the lessons down the side and then each of the steps to work on them. And then at the bottom there are just some one-off tasks. As said though, you can use this for other types of work as well. For instance, if you have a particular project which has multiple parts that have the same series of steps, then this kind of section can work really good for that. You could use this as kind of a study outline, so lessons, things to do for each of the study that you're doing for those lessons, general tasks that aren't necessarily tied to the lessons. If you have a job where you need to write a certain number of reports or pieces of work each month, then maybe you could list out what they are down the side and then write out all of the steps that you take in preparing those reports. Quite a few different applications, but over on the next page we have some project planning. Now the way that I like to do project planning is kind of modular, so each of these boxes is a module and you just fill it with things that are relevant for that project. For instance, details about the project, maybe contact details for people who are involved in the project, a checklist of tasks you need to do, any savings you need to do if you need to raise funds for the project, a schedule if maybe your project is related to an event, and then also a progress tracker with distinct milestones to hit along the way. Depending on the type of project, each of these modules might take up a little bit of extra space. You might want to have the project plan go across multiple pages, not just one. But onto the next page, this idea is an expenses log. I think that a B5 notebook would make for a very good budgeting kind of notebook. So in this one we have a space to record the date, the item that money was spent on, the category it falls under, and the price. At the bottom of the page, you can also total up how much you spend, and you might also want to include some layouts to indicate how much was spent in different categories and stuff like that. Instead of actually writing out the categories, you could use a color code to make life a little easier. You don't have to write out groceries like 10 times over or something. But if you don't really care about the category and all you want to record is the item and the cost, then you can probably fit this one into 2 columns as well. Just maximize your space on the page. Keeping on the topic of money though, our next idea is a savings tracker. This one is done on a month per month view, so you can see our little graph here has the amount up the side. It says 1 through 10, so it's like, yeah, I saved $7. This would probably be an indication of like units of 10 or units of 100, depending on how much you like to save. So maybe $10, $20, $30 saved or something similar. But then we also have the months along the bottom so that you can total it up per month and put them in here. What I think is also valuable is having what you're saving towards or what you're saving for on the page, just to keep it in mind. So what is it that you're saving for? How much are you trying to save for it? And when is a rough kind of due date for yourself? It doesn't have to be like an official due date, but giving yourself kind of an endpoint or a timeline to strive for can be helpful in keeping you motivated. For the next idea though, this one is a grid spacing guide, and oftentimes people will put this at the front. They might have this as a grid spacing ruler or a grid spacing bookmark or something like that. I've set this one up as a page in the notebook, so just indicating how many spaces across and down we have, and then different divisions that would be used if you were setting up different types of layouts. I do encourage you, if you're going to be setting up a page like this, consider the divisions that you actually use, not just common ones. So if you don't really find yourself using thirds across the page, like 3 columns for the page, then that's not really going to be helpful to put in. If instead you find that you split the page into quarters a lot, or maybe if you separate it into 7 horizontal sections, then those kind of things would be useful to put on here, especially if you're doing like weekly setups and stuff like that. Some of the ones that I've put in here, you can see this kind of like separated colored section here where we have like a darker pink, dark pink, pale pink, so on and so forth. That would be for setting up a monthly log, where you have the monthly log stationed at the bottom of the page. So you have each of those rows being one of the weeks on your calendar. We also have this pink stripe going up the side, which has the numbers 28, 29, 30, and 31, which indicates where you would put a number strip if you were putting in, I don't know, a regular vertical monthly style log, and you wanted that to sit again at the very bottom of the page, just to kind of indicate where you would put that first number. Another style of grid spacing guide is something like a layout sizing reference. So this would be for layouts that you find yourself using time and time again, and you just want to write down some notes about how much space you need for each of those sections. The more you use those layouts, the more kind of intuitive it'll get. You probably won't need a reference like this, but when you're first starting out, it can be quite useful. In this one, you would just draw a little thumbnail of what the layout would look like, and then write down some notes about how you would size that one out. I find that putting in W and H for width and height can be really helpful in making sure you're putting the dimensions in correctly. But on to our next idea. This one is a goal plan. The nice part about a B5, as we've said, is the additional space, which means that if you're doing a goal plan in here, you have plenty of space to brainstorm ideas, write timelines, all of that kind of thing. I've kept this one fairly simple, so just a space to write out what the goal is, the ideal outcome, any metrics of success, and then lists of tasks that you need to do. Another way that I've seen B5s used is as a reading journal, so you might want to use yours for that and have a TBR, or a to be read list. In this one, I have a little space for each of the book covers that you could either draw in or print off and stick in, and then a little space to rate those books out of 5. I drew in these stars myself, so they're a little bit wonky. You can get stickers, you can get stamps for those, but on to the next idea. This one is a bingo board, and a B5 is so good for a bingo board, especially if you're doing a 5x5 grid like we have here, because you have plenty of space to write things in there. In terms of what you would use a bingo board for though, there's a couple of different things. Some of them being for like reading challenges. You can put down different reading tropes in here and color them in when you read a book with that trope. You can do it for self-care, you could do it for movies, you could do it for little goals. What I would probably use this bottom section for, if not decoration, would be to set up some rewards for myself. So first horizontal, first diagonal, first vertical completed, and then what kind of a reward do I get if I complete the whole board? Especially if this bingo board is kind of to challenge yourself and like work on something that you find a little bit more difficult, having those rewards can keep you motivated to come back to it. Another layout that you might want to set up is a year in pixels, and the coolest part about a B5 is that it's 32 dot grid boxes across. Or at least this one is, it's from Archer and Olive, but because of that, it means that you can do a year in pixels that goes this way instead of this way. Most of the journals that we've looked at previously on the channel, you'll have a year in pixels that'll go vertically. So numbers 1 through 31 running down the side, the initials for each of the months along the top, and then you can see this little jagged line at the bottom because not every month has 31 days. But the cool part about a B5 journal is that you can rotate this and put it horizontal instead. In this instance, you would have the initials for the months going along the left here, and then the numbers for each of the days of the month, either at the top or at the bottom. If I were doing this in my journal, I would probably be more inclined to start January at the top rather than having it at the bottom here. In this kind of instance, you very much would want to rotate the journal to use it. I think it'd be a little bit more user-friendly to not have to do that. So if I were setting it up for myself, I would probably be inclined to put the numbers along the top, have them written so that they were readable from viewing the journal this way, and then I'd start January at the top, February, March, so on and so forth. In terms of how to use a year in pixels though, we have some ideas here, but most of the time people use it for things like moods, but I also find it's really good for long-term habit tracking, challenges, like sleep quality, water tracking, essentially anything that you could track on a daily basis with either a colored dot or a pattern or a check in a box. Anything like that can be done in a year in pixels. It's a really good way of seeing patterns across the entire year, and it can just be a fun little challenge for yourself. Flipping over though, our next idea is a weekly schedule. I've set this one up with a timeline in mind, so we have times running down the side, and then Monday through Sunday along the top. You don't have to draw the full grid in for this one, especially if you don't have timed tasks that really fit to the hour, but on this one you can mark in regular happenings for each of your weeks. I would probably be inclined to use this one as more like an ideal schedule for myself, so ideally I'm getting out of bed at this point, going to bed at this point, my evening routine starts at this point, that kind of stuff. But you could turn this one into more of a reusable layout by filling it in with pencil each week, or turning it into a reusable layout with book contact paper. We'll look at an example of that in a future layout. But on the right here we have weekly routines, and this is just writing down things that you want to try and do on specific days of the week. So maybe, for instance, every Thursday is laundry day, every Friday is date night, stuff like that. That way when you're planning out your week on your weekly layouts, you can come back to this one and make sure that you account time for all of the things that you want to get done. Because there will be some tasks that don't necessarily have a designated day, I've also put a some point section down the bottom here. But onto our next layout, this one is a meal planner. Now you might be able to see the shininess at the top here, and that indicates that this entire page has contact paper on it, and that's because this side of the layout is reusable. All of the stuff that's underneath the contact paper doesn't come off, but anything you write on top of it can be erased. For instance, if we decide that Tuesday is taco night, so we write in tacos, maybe Wednesday we're having sushi, and maybe on Thursday we're having, I don't know, pasta. It means that each week though, I can come in, I can write down my meal plan, I can write in things that I need on my shopping list, and then at the end of the week when I come to do my plan for the next week, I can just rub all of those things off and start again. As said, anything you put underneath the very shiny contact paper can't be erased, so those date labels, they're not coming off. If you have staples on your shopping list that you want to get every single week, those ones don't come off either. But I put this layout next to this one because I figured they're kind of related to each other. This one is your meal planner, so you write down all of the meals that you typically either like to cook or find easy to cook. They're like just your go-to kind of ones. You can separate this into different sections so that it's a little easier to find something you're looking for. For instance, separating them by protein type, separating them by ease or how fast they are to make, and of course having a section for your favorites. But then having that right next to your meal plan and shopping list means you can pull those out and put them onto your weekly menu. As we mentioned before, making a reusable layout can be really useful for things like the weekly schedule. So you just cover this page with the contact paper, and then you're able to write over the top of it each week, erase it at the end of the week and start again. The cool thing also is that you can use permanent marker on this and it doesn't bleed through to the other side of your page, which always feels kind of scandalous. But flipping over, our next idea are related lists. Now this one has a lot of different applications depending on what you want to use it for. So we have two examples here. One where we've split the page in half, so having a top and a bottom section, and one where we've split it into quarters, so having 1, 2, 3, 4. Some examples of how you could use this would be for a wants and a needs list. So this is effectively like a wish list versus things that you actually definitely need to purchase. And on a list like this, you can write down what the item is and the cost of the item. Then if and or when you get it, you can just check it off, or if you decide it's not something that you actually need, you can just cross it out. As for this section though, I filled it with books, movies, TV shows, and games, so this might be things to check out, or media to consume, or it could be media that you have consumed, so books that you read, movies that you watched, so on and so forth. Essentially though, the way that you would use these layouts is just for any lists of items that you want to have next to each other. They don't specifically have to be related to the categories I have here, but having a top-bottom approach or a quarters approach could be useful for some of the lists that you want to keep in your journal. On to the next idea though, and this one is a Kanban board. So this is for any type of work where you have a series of tasks that get repeated for separate individual pieces of work. For instance, for me, that would be video making, so planning the video, like making the layouts or anything like that, filming, editing, so on and so forth. But then each of my individual projects would get written on a sticky note. For instance, video 1, 2, 5. As I complete different stages of the video making process though, I can just pull up the individual sticky notes and then move them to the section that they're going to be in next. As I complete different stages of the video making process though, I can just pull up the sticky note and put it into the next suitable section. Depending on how you want to use the Kanban board, you can either have it so the last section is one that they kind of fall into when they're kind of wrapped up and then stay at, or it could be the section that's just before the last step, and then you can remove them once they're completely finished with. For instance, maybe my next kind of stage here is responding to comments, then when I get to the responding to comments stage, the sticky notes at the bottom would get removed from my notebook. Putting that back though, so we can have a look at our next layout. This one is for monthly tasks. In this one, we have the initials for each of the months of the year in a column that runs down the page, and then a space to write down what the tasks are. On this one, you'd write out all of the tasks that you want to complete on a monthly basis, and then as you do them for each of these months, you just check them off. If you wanted to keep track of when in particular they were done though, you could write the day number in each of the columns. And if you need more space to write down the tasks, you can get rid of the decoration and expand this one out. For tasks that are a little bit more frequent though, something like a weekly task list could be useful. And we have two different styles here. So either writing it so that we have each of the week numbers going across 2 rows, and then a little space to write in what the task is. You could actually write the numbers in for each of these if you wanted to, and then use like a colored marker or a sticker or something to indicate that it was done. I didn't really feel like writing in quite that many numbers, so I just wrote it in for the top one, and then I would just use that as a reference to fill in the rest. On this kind of a layout, you can include things that aren't weekly though. You can also include things that may be every second week or fortnightly. In that instance, I just put a little dot in any of the weeks where I wasn't intending on doing the task. But otherwise, you just check off to say, yes, I've done it, or put a little cross to say, no, it didn't happen. The next style we have is effectively the same, but you can see that the weeks go across 4 rows rather than just 2. Here, you'd still just check off to say it had happened, cross off to say that it didn't, and you can use dots to indicate any week where you weren't planning on doing those things. For the examples we have at the bottom, this would be kind of like a monthly task where you designate a particular week in the month where you're going to do that task. And then at the bottom, this would be a quarterly one. This isn't probably how I would do quarterly tasks, mainly because that's a lot of dot work for 4 tasks or 4 instances of that task in the year. But it is still a possibility if you don't have that many quarterly tasks and you want to include them on the same layout in the same style. This layout here though is a prioritization matrix, and this is one that we have on the channel as a separate video that kind of explains it. But the way this one is used is to assign priority to a series of things or items. They could be tasks, they could be movies, books, anything like that. Essentially any series of items that you want to assign a rating or a ranking to. You want to find out which one's the most important and which one's the least important, at least from that lineup. In this one, you would assign each of those different items a letter, so maybe each of your book titles you could write in next to each of these letters, and then they battle out head to head to consider which of those 2 is more important or more pressing. Really depends on the kind of items that you're trying to rank here. But let's just say that for item A versus item B, B is more important. We'd write a B in this box because it's A versus B. For A versus C, in this box, let's just say that C is more important, so we'd put a C in that box. For B versus C, maybe B is more important. We effectively just do this for the entire of the matrix, or each of the little boxes in here, and then in this totals row, we count up how many instances we had B and A and all of that in the rest of the matrix. As said, we do have a separate video on the channel that explains this one in full, but this is the style of layout that I'm using to do my book ratings come the end of the year. I'm going to take my 10 kind of potential favorite reads from across the year and use this prioritization matrix to figure out which one definitively was the top, what came in second, third, so on and so forth. I like this style better than a book bracket because you don't just find the top 1, you find the top 10 in order. Flipping over though, our next idea is a cleaning tracker. This one kind of gives you a combination of the monthly style log that we had before and also the weekly style one. I've also put in a space for annual and biannual. So annual you just check off once for the year, biannual you'll check off twice. But beside each of these check boxes in the top section, you just write down what the task is, check them off when they're complete. For the monthly one, you'd write them in beside these dots here, and then check them off for each month that you completed. And then for the weekly, similar idea, you'd write in the task beside the dot, and then we have a box for each of the weeks of the year. I've done this on just one page, you might need to expand it if you have more cleaning tasks. But on the other side of this layout, our next idea is waterfall tabs. They're kind of commonly called waterfall tabs, but I like to call them waterfall Dutch doors because that's effectively what they are. But the nice part about having some additional width in your B5 notebook is that you can play around with things like this and not sacrifice too much space on your page. Effectively, this is done just by taking a series of pages and subsequently cutting down less and less. So this first one has the most cut off to make this kind of narrower page. The next one we've cut off a little bit less than that and made it not quite as narrow. Then the third one we've only cut off a little bit, and the one at the very back we haven't cut off anything at all. To make it so that these stand out though, you can see we've put in things like the tape, we've put in some just drawn decorations, some of these washi sticker kind of things, just so that you can kind of differentiate between each of them, and it ends up being a nice little piece of decoration. Flipping over though, our next idea is a monthly summary page. So this one just has a little space for each of the months of the year where you can write in some highlights. This could also be kind of used as a future log if you want, or just a place to write a little summary of memories from the month, things like that. And speaking about memories, I also wanted to include a memories page in here because the nice part about the B5 and the extra space is that you can print off pictures and still actually see who's in them. All of these pictures were from my friend's wedding, and this journaling here would actually be like personal journaling. I just used some washi tape because this is just an idea, but you can stick in your photos, write in little captions about who was there, when was it taken, thoughts, feelings, funny stories, anything like that. I think that a B5 journal would make for a very good memory keeper. But flipping over, on this one we have an example of media reviews. So maybe if you're using this as a reading journal, you can put in a little summary of the books that you read and your thoughts about them, maybe do a little star rating for them. I personally really like it when my media reviews have cover pictures, so you can see I've got plenty of cover pictures here. For the review, I like to stick in a cover for the book that I read, then write in my little blurb. But something that I think is really fun that I've seen people with reading journals do is making a little kind of, I don't know, dedicated page just to stick in the covers of the books. They don't even add ratings, they just stick in the book covers. You could totally use a layout like this for I don't know, 25 books to read in 2025, or maybe just your top reads, the ones that are like your all-time favorites. I made all of these on sticker paper and then just cut them out and stuck them in, but having some kind of master list or master collage of the things that you've been consuming could be a lot of fun too. Flipping on over though, the next layout idea we have is a weekly tracker page. So it really depends on what kind of thing you're trying to track as to how it would look in your journal. The ones we have on the left here are really just a did it happen or didn't it happen. So a little box for each of the weeks of the year, you just check off to say that it happened or put a dot to say that it didn't. Whereas the ones that we have on the right are more like a scale of happening. So for instance, an example we've got is like daily average steps across the week. So for this one, each of the columns represents a week, and then the numbers up the side represent how many thousand steps on average you did across that week. I've also indicated a couple different ways you could fill this one in, so just putting little dots in, you could fully color in the boxes if you wanted to, just X them out, or just color in where you got up to, so you don't have to color in quite as much as you would with these other ones. Another layout idea that you might want to include is a when did I last page, and depending on the tasks that you're putting into this layout and how frequent you want to complete them, the way that you actually set this one up might look a little different. So at the top we have semi-frequent tasks, ones that maybe you try to do every month, every couple of months. Here you'd write down what the tasks are, and then we have a column for each of the months, and you could just write in the day number that they got accomplished. Whereas the ones at the bottom are for those infrequent tasks, the ones that you maybe only do twice, 4 times a year. In this one, you write out what the task is, and then you have a little box to write in when it was last done. It can be useful in this one, especially for those very infrequent tasks, to write in the last instance of having done it, especially if it's the kind of thing that you try and do every 6 months, and the last time you did it was like I know, October last year or something. You want to make sure that then you're kind of coming back in the first quarter of the next year to do that task again. Flipping over though, our next idea is a progress tracker. This one was set up with a series of similar projects in mind, so each of these columns indicates a stage of the project. You'd write in what the projects are down the side here and just color up to the relevant section as you complete parts of the project. I set this one up thinking about a series of blog posts, so you'd write down the date that you want the blog post to be published, the title of the blog post, and then these would be the stages for completing those blog posts. Again, just because I've set it up with blog posts in mind does not mean that it can only be used for that. You just have to change out the headers and maybe the different stages to something that's more relevant to your series of projects. You could also use this for multiple types of projects too, so maybe make this a percentage progress bar rather than a kind of stepwise one like we've got here. But the next idea we have is an episode tracker. For this one, each of the little boxes represents an episode and each of the rows represents a season. I thought of this one in terms of TV shows in particular, but you could also do it for podcasts or other things that are episodic. So we just have the numbers 1 through 25 along the top because our longest season on this tracker is 25 episodes. And then as you watch the episodes, you just color in the individual boxes. You don't have to draw these so that they only come up to a specific point. You can just black out the boxes that aren't relevant. But flipping on over, and our next idea is commonplacing. The general gist of a commonplace notebook is effectively having it as a one-stop shop for all of the different snippets and quotes and notes that you collect just as you go about everyday life, consume pieces of media, do readings, watch documentaries and shows and whatever else. I find it very interesting, but the way that this layout works is that you have a column down the side to indicate what each of your entries are about. Especially if you have common areas that you like to research or like to write notes about, those are the kind of things that you would indicate along the side, mainly so that when you're flipping through the pages of your commonplacing, you can very easily see what each of the pieces you've noted down is related to. You'd probably also want to have a key somewhere in your notebook to indicate what each of your symbols actually represents. You might want to use a color code. You could of course just write it out, but you probably want something a little bit more graphic or a little bit visual, so it's very easy to see what each of your entries is related to. Another type of note-taking that you might want to use your journal for though is meeting notes. B5s can be great for that because it has ample space to write your notes down. The way that I've done this one is that we have general details at the top, we have an agenda and maybe a time prediction for the agenda, and then also a space to write down how much time was actually taken by each of those so that you can use that information for future predictions about how long your agenda should go for. At the bottom though, we have the actual note space, and we have some columns on the side to indicate the difference between a note, an idea, and tasks that you might want to follow up on. Just so that as you're writing them down, it's very easy to pick those out come the end of doing your note taking. You don't have to read back through everything just to find out the stuff that you have to action. On to the next idea though, this one is a monthly challenge space. For this one, we just have a little calendar for each of the months of the year, and then next to the monthly initial, you write down what the challenge is. You could of course set this one up so it's the same challenge across the entire year, and then you don't really need to do that next to the month name, you could just do it at the top of the page. But if you want to have a different challenge for each month, which I think is a little bit of fun, then you have space to write that in. For instance, if you want challenges related to saving more or spending less, you could have things like a no fast food challenge, so you're not spending money on that. You could have a save $1 a day challenge. You could have a no buy month or a low buy month, that kind of stuff. They're not necessarily things that you want to do across the entire year, but just doing them for an individual month could be a bit of fun. Getting into some monthly related pages though, our first one here is a monthly plan. In this one, I have a mini calendar and a space to write down key dates. We also then have numbers 1 through 5, just for each of the weeks of the month and things that are happening or things that you want to accomplish in that week. On the right, we have a general task space and a next month space, and there's plenty of space to write in each of these, or you could even expand it further, have this kind of layout across 2 pages, and essentially double your space to write in each of your sections. Our next monthly page though is that of a monthly log, and this one is set up with the kind of original bullet journal system in mind. So you can see we have the time ladder for events down the side here, we have the task list on the right hand page. Because of the B5 and because of that extra space, you also have this section down the bottom, a space of infinite possibilities, really depends on what you want to include, but it could be a tracker, it could be for gratitude, maybe some notes about things that are happening next next month, really anything that you want to include. And while this is the style of monthly log that is in the original bullet journal system, it's always good to have some options, and the monthly log offers plenty of options. So flipping over, our next idea is having a monthly calendar that's just on one page. Now this one in particular I consider to be a rotated calendar because you'd still use it looking at the page this way, but instead of the weeks going across the page, they actually go down. It can certainly take some getting used to using a layout like this, but you can see that we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so on and so forth for the first week. Then we have the second week, third. It's a little bit different to how you kind of use your typical wall calendar, but what you can also do is just set it up in the same way, but have Monday at the bottom here, then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and just rotate your journal to actually use the calendar. I just personally find that if I make myself have to rotate my journal, I'm less likely to use the layouts that require that of me, but I can also understand that using it in this orientation might be a little tricky, at least initially. Another style of monthly log, which is vertical again, has the number and the initial for each of the days of the month in the middle of the page, so that you've effectively separated your page into two separate columns. This allows you to break up your events into different areas, for instance home versus work, or maybe if you're trying to keep two people's schedule in one notebook, it could be you versus your partner or somebody else. Again, because this one has like 31 days maximum for each of the months, you do have some extra space at the top and the bottom, which you can use for notes or decoration or anything else. My personal preference for monthly logs though is always going to be calendar layouts, and a B5 offers so much space to put in a calendar layout. Each of our calendar boxes here is 8 dot grid boxes across, so lots of space to write in. And you can see we can very comfortably fit a 6-week calendar in here as well. So for those months that have like 2 days or 1 day in the first week, and then either 1 or 2 days in the last week, we can still fit all of those weeks in. There's also the opportunity to have a to-do list down the side, or it could be a space for decoration, trackers, all of that kind of thing. But still, lots of space to write on this calendar, which can be very handy. We do have some other styles of monthly logs though. This one I consider to be the condensed original. So rather than having a timeline on one page and a task list on the other, you've just kind of smashed them together and put them on the same page, because the B5 still has plenty of room to write in each of the columns. Down the bottom we can put those little trackers, so we have 31 boxes across here, and then something to indicate what the actual habit is, either a label or maybe a little icon. I opted for labels for this one, and then the check mark just shows me how to actually use my tracker. But in terms of another style of monthly log, this one still has the vertical list of the events that are going on, but it also has a vertical habit tracker with little icons to represent the habits, a space for daily gratitude, a space for a priorities list, and a mini calendar at the top. Although these ones are both more condensed, I feel like they still offer a good amount of space to write for each of the sections. But if you really wanted to condense everything from your monthly setup down to one layout, then something like this layout could be for you. On this one we have the full calendar in the kind of middle of the page, and then we've also got little sections around the outside. So this is a daily habit tracker for 1 through 30 days with the kind of icons to represent what those habits are. We also have a weekly task list, so 1 through 5 for each of the weeks, and then writing down what those tasks are. A section for goals, a little mood tracker up the side here where you just draw in a smiley face to indicate how happy versus not happy you were in the day. A space for general tasks at the top, and then also an expenses log down the side. All of these sections are interchangeable with other things, but they fit around the calendar quite nicely. It would be very much like a one-stop shop for all of the things that were going on in the month, which I just think is kind of cool. Stepping away from the monthly layouts and into the weekly ones though, our weekly spread here has a space for each of the days of the week, along with a priorities box and a notes box. And technically speaking, this could just be used as a one-page weekly, but I've also paired it with the section over here, which has a kind of time ladder or a schedule for each of the days, and then a space for a meal planner at the bottom. You just mark onto this little time ladder as to what was going on in the week, so you could see when you needed to be in what places or when things were happening. You might want to put in some rough kind of time indications down the side here to say, oh yeah, I really would like to stop working by 6 p.m. or things like that. The only one I've put in is for midday so that you can easily see where the middle of the day is, and possibly the dashed line at the top and the bottom just indicates going to sleep and getting up in the morning. That's one style for a weekly spread though. Flipping over, another weekly spread is a vertical style. So we just have a column for each of the days of the week and then a general notes or tasks space on the side. At the top of each of the daily boxes, we have a space to write down breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. So maybe it's a meal log or a meal plan. And then underneath this, you just write in everything that was going on. It could be for just kind of like bulleted points, like bullet journaling style, or it could be actual long form journaling. If I were going to use this style for long form journaling, I'd probably only want to have 3 columns, so 3 days per page. And then instead of having a full week per view, I'd just have 6 days per spread. You don't actually have to fit an entire week on one spread. In the next layouts actually, we're only doing a full week on one page rather than one spread. So the first idea we have here is having an Alistair style task list, where we have initials for each of the days of the week, where you could put down bullets to say, oh yes, I want to do this task on that day. Next to this though, we also have a column of trackers, and these ones are different sizes depending on what you're tracking. So moods and energy just have 5 rows. So very high energy, kind of high energy, medium, low, very low. Similar idea for the moods. For the steps though, we have 10 segments, so maybe that's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. And then for sleep hours, we have 1 through 8, depends on how much you're trying to sleep or how much sleep you're trying to get. But it just makes this kind of nice little sidebar with all of your trackers in one space. For this style of weekly log though, we have a general task list on the right and then a space for each of the days of the week down the left. You could possibly use it so that this space on the left is kind of for events or happenings, appointments, and the task list is for things to do. Or if you wanted a dedicated space for notes, you could possibly split the task list into 2 sections, make the bottom section for notes, something like that. This one doesn't have any trackers, but it is nice and simple and thus very approachable. Flipping over though, and our next page has a couple of different ideas for habit tracking. The first one is horizontal, so with numbers 1 through 31 across the page, and then an additional little column here for those indications of what each habit is. In this one, I've just used little icons, but you could use color coding if you wanted to. For this style, it is important to include some kind of a key, especially if you're doing this for the first time, just to make sure that you know what each of the symbols actually represent. But I love that the B5 has enough width that you can do an entire month across the page. If that's not really your style though, then we have a couple of other ones. So this one is kind of what I'm calling a stacked habit tracker. So you just have 2 rows which indicate each of the days of the month. Because I was working with the idea of a 31-day month, we have 16 at the top and 15 at the bottom, which give you the total of 31, one for each day of the month. And beside this, you just write down what the habit is. Another style that is very popular is the mini calendar style. So this is just drawing out a mini calendar for the month over and over again, one for each of your habits, and then coloring in the relevant box as you do that habit for each day of the month. We do have a separate video on the channel of different habit tracker styles, but this is just 3 of the ones you could use. And it doesn't have to be for habit tracking specifically, it could be for routine tracking, routine building, things that you don't necessarily consider habits but you want to indicate when you did or didn't do them, or when they did or didn't happen, which brings us to our next idea, which is a symptom tracker. On this one we have the day numbers running down the left hand side, along with the initials for each of the days. These ones are washi tapes from Oops-a-Daisy, very handy, you don't have to write all the numbers out yourself. But then each of the columns here would indicate one of the symptoms that you're keeping track of. Symptoms are very personal, so it depends on what you want to keep track of as to what would actually get indicated on here, but it could be things like headaches, muscle aches, joint pains, nausea, fatigue, low mood, low energy. There are a lot of different options, but something that could be useful, rather than just indicating whether it happened or it didn't happen, is indicating the severity of the happening. So yes, maybe you had a headache, but was it very mild? Was it kind of notable? Was it severe? Just so that then across the month you can kind of see trends and patterns with how that information stacks up against other things as well. What I would probably be inclined to do, depending on the number of symptoms I were tracking, is actually split this into 2 trackers that sit beside each other. On one of them have my kind of health habits, so things like did I get enough sleep, did I get enough water, have I actually eaten well today, and then on the other side have the symptoms, so I can kind of see how they play against each other or how they kind of influence each other. Of course, this is not a definitive list of the different layouts you can set up in your B5, but hopefully it's given you some inspiration. If you were on the hunt for more layout ideas, then the playlist on screen is the next one to check out. This one has a bunch of different layout ideas that you could include in any journal, so click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.